September 2025. A congressman from Iowa sits in his district office reviewing letters from constituents. Not the usual complaints about potholes or taxes. These are different. Medical debt. Student loans. Credit card balances at 27% interest. A farmer who lost his land because a single bad harvest triggered a debt spiral he couldn't escape. A teacher working 3 jobs to pay off loans for a degree that was supposed to lift her out of poverty. He decides to act. He drafts H.R. 4782, the American Debt Jubilee Act. The concept is ancient. Mesopotamian kings did this routinely. Cancel consumer debts, reset the system, let people breathe. He expected pushback from banks. He expected lobbyists. He expected Fox News to call him a socialist. What he didn't expect was Mary Thompson. Mary is 67, a retired nurse from Ohio. She worked 40 years, saved diligently, put everything into her pension fund managed by CalPERS. She has $180,000 in her account. She needs it. Her husband has Parkinson's. Their medical bills run $4,000 a month even with Medicare. 2 weeks after the congressman announces his bill, Mary appears at his town hall. She's not angry in an abstract way. She's terrified. Because someone told her, someone from a very official-sounding organization called the American Retirement Security Coalition, that if H.R. 4782 passes, her pension fund will collapse. The fund holds Treasury bonds. U.S. government debt. If that debt gets cancelled or restructured, the fund loses 40% of its value overnight. "You're trying to steal my retirement," she says, her voice shaking. "I worked my entire life for this. And you want to give it away to people who borrowed money they couldn't afford to repay." The congressman tries to explain. "Mary, this isn't about your pension." "Yes it is," she interrupts. "They showed me the numbers. My fund holds $47 billion in Treasury bonds. Your bill wipes that out. You're robbing millions of retirees to help people who made bad decisions." She's not alone. The town hall fills with retirees. They all received the same materials. The same talking points. The same fear. The congressman returns to Washington shaken. Because Mary isn't wrong about the numbers. She's just wrong about who's using her as a weapon. Now imagine you're watching this in 2026. You have student debt, medical debt, maybe a mortgage you can barely afford. You see someone finally trying to fight for ordinary people. And then you see the weapon deployed against him, other ordinary people whose retirements have been turned into hostages. This is how the trap works. Let's go back. Not to 1929 this time. Further. Ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 2400 BCE. A Sumerian farmer borrows grain to plant his fields. Bad harvest. He can't repay. Under normal circumstances, he loses his land, maybe sells his children into debt slavery. The debt compounds. His family is destroyed. But every few decades, the king declares an anduraram, a debt cancellation. All agricultural debts are erased. Land returns to original owners. Debt slaves are freed. The system resets. This wasn't charity. It was practical economic management. The kings understood something: when too many people are crushed by debt, the economy stops functioning. Farmers can't produce. Soldiers can't fight. Tax revenue collapses. Debt cancellation prevented economic paralysis. Babylonian King Hammurabi did it. Egyptian pharaohs did it. Biblical Jubilee years followed the same principle: every 49 years, debts forgiven, land returned, economic slate wiped clean. The crucial detail: these systems worked because debt was between individual lenders and borrowers. The merchant who lent grain. The landowner who extended credit. When the king canceled debt, the burden fell on specific wealthy individuals who could absorb the loss. There was no complex intermediary structure. No pension funds. No insurance companies pooling millions of small investors' money and using it to buy debt instruments. The king didn't have to worry that canceling one farmer's debt would wipe out thousands of other farmers' retirement savings. The system was simple. Creditor. Debtor. King with enough power to tell creditors, "You lose this round. Deal with it." Fast forward to the American Revolution. The new United States emerged with massive war debt. Alexander Hamilton's solution, federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national debt system, bonds backed by tax revenue. This worked because the bondholders were known entities, wealthy merchants, foreign governments, banks. When Andrew Jackson paid off the entire national debt in 1835, it was possible because the debt structure was direct and simple. You knew who held the bonds. You paid them. Done. Even during the Great Depression, debt jubilees were discussed seriously. Thousands of farms were foreclosed. Families evicted. But the political structure made debt cancellation feasible if leaders had wanted it. The holders of farm debt were primarily regional banks and wealthy landowners. FDR could have nationalized those debts and restructured them. He chose different tools, but the option existed. Here's what made it possible: the debt holders were concentrated entities that could be identified, negotiated with, or overruled. Now we arrive at the fundamental transformation. Between 1974 and 2008, the entire architecture of American debt was rebuilt. Not because of some conspiracy in a smoke-filled room. Because of a series of policy decisions, each seemingly reasonable on its own, that collectively created something new, a debt system where cancellation became impossible because ordinary people's retirements were welded to the debt structure itself. In 1974, ERISA created regulatory frameworks for defined contribution plans, 401(k), IRAs, pension funds that invested worker savings in financial markets. The stated goal was giving workers more control and protecting their benefits. The effect: trillions of dollars from ordinary workers flowed into financial markets, creating enormous demand for safe assets. Treasury bonds. Corporate debt. Mortgage-backed securities. By 2008, pension funds held $2.7 trillion. By 2025, that number reached $7.8 trillion. These funds needed returns. They bought debt instruments. Not as abstract financial products, as the foundation of millions of retirements. Then came securitization. Banks stopped holding loans on their books. Instead, they bundled thousands of mortgages, student loans, auto loans, and credit card debts into securities and sold them to investors. Who bought them? Pension funds. Insurance companies. College endowments. Mutual funds managing retirement accounts. The mortgage on your house stopped being between you and a bank. It became a microscopic piece of a security held by CalPERS in California, a teacher's pension in Ohio, and a state retirement system in Texas. When someone proposes canceling student debt, they're not proposing that Citibank take a loss. They're proposing that the pension fund holding securitized student loan assets take a loss. And that pension fund contains the retirement savings of a nurse in Ohio, a firefighter in Oregon, and a factory worker in Michigan. Here's what most people don't know, what financial analysts discovered while analyzing Federal Reserve data. As of Q2 2025, pension funds hold over $1 trillion in Treasury securities alone. When you add insurance companies and their holdings of corporate bonds, mortgage-backed securities, and securitized consumer debt, the total reaches approximately 38% of all U.S. Treasury debt and significant portions of household debt instruments. These aren't Wall Street speculators. These are retirement accounts. Your coworker's 401(k). Your aunt's pension. Your own IRA if you have one. This is where it gets interesting. In the old system, if you wanted to cancel farm debt or restructure corporate bonds, you faced powerful banks and wealthy investors. They'd fight back with lawyers and lobbyists. But ultimately, they were a small group who could be politically defeated if the majority demanded it. In the new system, you can't attack the creditors without attacking millions of ordinary people whose retirements depend on those debt payments continuing. The creditors have become invisible. They've been replaced by your neighbors. When the congressman proposes his debt jubilee, he's not fighting Citibank's CEO. He's fighting Mary Thompson and 10 million people like her whose pensions hold the debt he wants to cancel. This wasn't an accident. This architecture was built deliberately, reform by reform, to make the debt structure politically untouchable. Because if ordinary people's retirements collapse when debt is cancelled, you can't cancel debt. Ever. Let's examine exactly how this trap functions mechanically. Because the genius isn't just that pensions hold debt. It's that the structure has multiple layers of protection that make any attempt at debt relief trigger cascading damage to ordinary people. Treasury bonds are rated AAA. The highest possible safety rating. Pension funds are legally required to hold a certain percentage of AAA-rated assets. It's called the prudent investor rule. Fiduciaries must invest conservatively. If the U.S. government restructures or cancels any portion of its debt, rating agencies will downgrade U.S. bonds. Not just the restructured portion. All of them. Because restructuring proves the government might not honor its obligations. When Greece restructured its debt in 2012, ratings went from A to CCC. When Argentina did it in 2001, ratings went to default. If U.S. Treasuries get downgraded from AAA to AA or lower, pension funds are legally required to sell them and buy something else. But here's the problem. Pension funds hold over $1 trillion in treasuries. If they're all forced to sell simultaneously, there's no market for that volume. Prices collapse. What was worth $1 trillion becomes worth $600 billion. Maybe $500 billion. Mary Thompson's $180,000 becomes $110,000. Overnight. Not because her fund made bad decisions. Because someone tried to help people with debt. Insurance companies hold $6.3 trillion in assets backing their policies. Life insurance. Disability insurance. Annuities. These companies promise to pay claims and benefits. Those promises are backed by their investment portfolios. When bond values collapse, insurance companies become insolvent. They can't meet their obligations. State insurance regulators step in, freeze policies, and begin liquidation proceedings. You have a $500,000 life insurance policy. You've paid premiums for 20 years. Your family depends on it. Debt cancellation triggers bond collapse. Your insurance company fails. Your policy becomes worth 40 cents on the dollar if you're lucky. Maybe 20 cents if the company's portfolio was heavily weighted to cancel debt. You weren't a creditor. You were just trying to protect your family. But the system made you a hostage. The mechanism gets worse. When treasuries and bonds lose value, pension funds show deficits. They're required to report funding ratios, assets versus liabilities. CalPERS needs 80% funded to be considered healthy. If bond values collapse and they drop to 60%, the state of California is legally required to make up the difference. But California's budget is already strained. They can't come up with $200 billion to shore up CalPERS. So they have three options: cut pension benefits, political suicide; raise taxes massively, political suicide; or let the pension fund fail, economic and political apocalypse. Multiply this across 50 states. Public employee pension funds covering police, firefighters, teachers, sanitation workers. They all hold the same debt. They all collapse together. The congressman proposing debt cancellation doesn't just face banks and lobbyists. He faces 10 million retirees whose pensions are at risk, 30 million workers whose future pensions depend on current fund solvency, 40 million people with life insurance policies backed by at-risk companies, and every governor and state legislator who must explain to constituents why their pensions failed. The American Retirement Security Coalition that sent Mary to that town hall? It's funded by bond market participants. But Mary doesn't know that. She just knows her pension fund told her she's at risk. And she is. The threat is real. The brilliant part of this trap, the people being used as weapons don't know they're weapons. They genuinely believe they're defending their own interests. And in a sense, they are, because the system was built to make their interests dependent on continuing debt slavery for everyone else. Ancient kings could declare jubilee because the creditors were a small elite who could be forced to accept losses. American revolutionaries could manage debt because bondholders were concentrated and identifiable. Even during the Depression, debt relief was possible because the structure allowed targeting specific creditor classes. 2026 is different in three fundamental ways. In 1933, if FDR had restructured farm debt, it would have hurt regional banks and landowners. Maybe 50,000 entities. Manageable political problem. Today, if you restructure mortgages, you're hitting mortgage-backed securities held by 18,000 pension funds, 3,200 insurance companies, 8,000 mutual funds, and 90 million individual retirement accounts. You can't draw a political line where bad guys are on one side and victims on the other. Everyone is intermingled. The system isn't hierarchical anymore. It's a web. Pull one strand and the whole thing vibrates. When Hammurabi declared jubilee, creditors found out over weeks or months. When Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt, the process took years. Even the Greek debt restructuring in 2012 was negotiated over 18 months. Modern financial markets operate at algorithmic speed. If Congress passed a debt restructuring bill, the market response would happen in hours. Literally. Trading algorithms programmed to sell treasuries and bonds if restructuring language appears in legislation would trigger within minutes of the bill text being published. March 2020 showed this. When COVID lockdowns were announced, Treasury markets, supposedly the most liquid, stable markets in the world, seized up. Bid-ask spreads widened from 0.5 basis points to 15 basis points. Pension funds trying to sell bonds couldn't find buyers. Not because treasuries were bad investments, but because the market infrastructure couldn't handle simultaneous selling. A debt jubilee bill would trigger selling orders measured in trillions. Not over months. Over hours. The market would simply break. Trades wouldn't execute. Pension funds would see their account values freeze mid-collapse. Mary Thompson wouldn't gradually lose money, she'd log into her pension account and see system unavailable during high volatility. When ancient kings declared jubilee, they had ultimate power. When American presidents restructured debt, they had tools, federal power, legal authority, political capital. In 2026, those tools are gone. Why? Because they were already used up preventing the last crisis. 2008 financial crisis, Fed cut rates to zero, bought $4.5 trillion in assets, expanded its balance sheet 10x. Government backstopped banks, insurance companies, GSEs. 2020 COVID crisis, Fed cut rates to zero again, bought another $4.2 trillion in assets, expanded its balance sheet to $9 trillion. Government spent $5 trillion in stimulus. The Fed balance sheet is now $7.4 trillion, still elevated from crisis interventions. Interest rates are at 5%. Government debt is $35 trillion. There's no room for another massive intervention. If debt cancellation triggers the collapse I described, pensions failing, insurance companies going insolvent, Treasury market seizing, the tools to fix it don't exist anymore. The Fed can't print another $5 trillion without destroying the currency. The government can't borrow another $10 trillion without triggering a sovereign debt crisis. Interest rates can't go much lower without going negative, and that creates its own disasters. The system used all its ammunition preventing previous crises. There's nothing left for the next one. Here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous: the people with access to inside information are acting like something is coming. Not retail investors. Not YouTubers. The smartest institutional money in the world. Q4 2024 and Q1 2025 saw the highest corporate insider selling since 2007. Not retail panic. Executives selling their own company stock. CEOs, CFOs, board members. They have lock-up periods, planned selling schedules, and restrictions. When they sell anyway, it means something. Corporate insiders sold shares at a ratio of 23.7 sellers to 1 buyer in Q4 2024, the highest since digital disclosure rules began in 2004. These aren't people timing a 10% correction. They're getting liquid before something breaks. And they know the pension system architecture I just described. They know their company's bonds are held by pension funds. They know what happens if the debt structure cracks. CalPERS, the largest public pension fund in America, made a quiet change in January 2025. They increased their cash and cash equivalents allocation from 1% to 8%. That's $43 billion moved from bonds and stocks into liquid instruments. Why? Their public statements mention market volatility and liability management. Translation: they're preparing for an environment where they need to meet redemptions quickly without being forced to sell assets at distressed prices. This is remarkable. Pension funds are designed to be fully invested. Holding cash means accepting lower returns. They only do this when they fear something worse than missing returns, being unable to pay benefits because their assets are trapped in illiquid or collapsing markets. Insurance companies aren't selling bonds, but they're doing something else: increasing reserves against potential losses and buying credit default swaps, insurance against bond defaults. AIG, the company that nearly collapsed in 2008 from credit default swap exposure, is now buying CDSs to protect against corporate bond defaults. They're paying premiums to hedge against the very scenario I described: mass bond downgrades and defaults triggered by debt restructuring. Why would an insurance company, which holds bonds as long-term assets, suddenly hedge against their own portfolio? Because they've run the scenarios. They know what a debt jubilee would do. They're preparing for political pressure to force debt cancellation and the market chaos that would follow. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world at $1.6 trillion, reduced its U.S. bond holdings by 22% in Q4 2024. They're not panicking about American creditworthiness. They're repositioning because they see political risk, the risk that American politicians, facing pressure from voters drowning in debt, might try something dramatic. China is doing the same. Not because of geopolitical tensions. Because they recognize the debt jubilee movement is gaining momentum. They're selling treasuries while there's still liquidity, before any restructuring announcement triggers the cascade I described. The institutions that understand the system's architecture are quietly preparing for its failure. They're not warning the public. They're protecting themselves while Mary Thompson shows up at town halls defending the bonds they're abandoning. We've examined how the trap was built. We've seen the mechanisms. We've watched the smart money prepare for disaster. Now we arrive at the core impossibility: this system mathematically cannot continue, but it also cannot be reformed without triggering the very collapse it was designed to prevent. Total U.S. household debt reached $18.59 trillion as of Q3 2025. This includes mortgages, $12, 1 trillion, student loans, $1.65 trillion, auto loans, $1.66 trillion, and credit cards, $1.23 trillion. A significant portion of this debt is held by pension funds and insurance companies either directly or through securitized instruments. You cannot cancel this debt without destroying retirement accounts. But you also cannot sustain this debt level. Here's why: debt service payments now consume 42% of the median household's discretionary income after housing, food, and healthcare. In 2000, it was 28%. In 1980, it was 19%. At current trajectory, by 2030, debt service will consume 55% of discretionary income. By 2035, 68%. This is mathematically unsustainable. People cannot pay. But if people default en masse, the pension funds holding their debt take losses. Mary Thompson's retirement collapses anyway, not from debt cancellation, but from mass default. The Congressman faces three paths: cancel debt, and pension funds collapse. Mary Thompson and 10 million retirees destroyed. Political annihilation. Don't cancel debt, and debtors default over time. Pension funds decline gradually. Slower disaster but same endpoint. Government bailout, print money to compensate pension funds for debt cancellation. Currency devalues. Inflation destroys everyone's savings anyway. There is no fourth option. The math doesn't allow it. Ancient kings could declare jubilee because the loss fell on a small creditor class that could absorb it. Modern America has no equivalent. The losses are distributed across the entire population. Everyone is both debtor and creditor. Everyone is trapped. Financial historians have modeled this. There are only three ways it resolves. Deflationary spiral, debtors default slowly. Home foreclosures increase from 250,000 per year to 2 million per year. Bankruptcies surge. Banks restrict lending. Economy contracts. Pension funds lose value from asset price collapse rather than debt cancellation. Everyone gets poorer together. Duration, 10 to 15 years. Think Japan's lost decades, but worse because American households have less savings cushion. Inflationary escape, government inflates away debt by printing money. $1 million in retirement savings still exists, but buys 60% less. Debt nominally remains but becomes easier to repay with devalued dollars. Creditors, pension funds, lose through inflation rather than default. Everyone gets poorer together but faster. Duration, 5 to 7 years. Think 1970s stagflation but more severe. Sudden restructuring, political pressure forces debt cancellation despite consequences. Pension funds collapse. Government attempts bailout. Currency crisis. Foreign creditors dump treasuries. Interest rates spike. Government can't borrow to fund bailout. Fed prints anyway. Hyperinflation. Duration, 2 to 3 years. Think Argentina 2001 or Greece 2012 but with the world's reserve currency at stake. The historian's consensus: we're heading into inflationary escape with risk of cascading into sudden restructuring if mismanaged. The trap is complete. The debt cannot be paid. The debt cannot be forgiven. The system that was designed to protect pension funds has instead guaranteed their destruction. It just hasn't happened yet. Let's return to that town hall in Iowa. September 2025. Mary Thompson confronting the Congressman. She's not wrong to be afraid. Her pension genuinely holds the debt he wants to cancel. The American Retirement Security Coalition that sent her there is funded by bond market participants, but the threat to her retirement is real. The Congressman isn't wrong either. The people drowning in debt need help. The system is crushing them. Something must be done. They're both right. They're both doomed. That's the trap. Compare this to the ancient world. When the Sumerian king declared debt jubilee, creditors lost but the economic system survived. The farmer kept his land. The merchant took a loss but continued trading. Society reset and continued. When the American Congressman proposes debt jubilee, there is no reset. There is only choosing which group of ordinary people gets destroyed first. The debtors who drown slowly or the retirees who collapse suddenly. The brilliant cruelty of this architecture, it turned ordinary Americans into weapons against each other while the institutions that built this system quietly prepare their own exits. Remember those pension funds increasing cash positions? They're preparing to survive the collapse by being liquid enough to meet redemptions while others fail. The insiders selling stock? They're converting equity to cash before the cascade. The sovereign wealth funds reducing Treasury holdings? They're preserving value by exiting before the restructuring. They built a system that makes debt relief impossible by weaponizing your neighbor's retirements. And while you and Mary Thompson fight over whether debt should be canceled, they're moving their money to safety. The choice you face isn't between debt cancellation or debt continuation. That choice has already been made by mathematics. The debt system is failing whether anyone acts or not. Your choice is simpler and more urgent. Do you prepare while there's still time, or do you wait until the crowd realizes the exits are closing? The congressman's bill won't pass. The debt won't be canceled in any organized way. Instead, it will collapse through defaults, inflation, or restructuring forced by crisis rather than chosen by design. Mary Thompson's pension will be devastated regardless. The debtors will suffer regardless. The only question is timing and severity. You still have options, though they're shrinking. Reduce exposure to pension systems if you can. Build cash reserves outside the financial system. Understand that the Treasury bonds in your 401k aren't safe anymore, they're hostages in a political standoff. Watch what the smart money does, not what it says. Recognize that when insurance companies hedge their own bond portfolios, they're preparing for scenarios they publicly claim are impossible. The congressman from Iowa learned something in that town hall. The system doesn't need to convince everyone it's working. It just needs to turn half the victims against the other half. Make them fight each other while the structure collapses around them. Mary Thompson will defend the bonds destroying her pension because she's been told those bonds are her pension. The debt-crushed farmer will blame her for his suffering. Neither will see the institutions that built this trap walking away intact. Your grandfather in the Depression could see the bank run coming and withdraw his cash. Mary in 2026 can see the collapse coming but cannot access her pension without triggering the penalties and restrictions that trap her wealth inside the burning building. The ancient king could declare jubilee because creditors and debtors were separate classes. In 2026, you're both. Your debt funds someone else's retirement. Their retirement depends on your debt payments. When the system breaks, you both lose. The timeline is closing. The math stopped working 3 years ago. The smart money knows. The pension funds know. They're preparing while telling you everything is fine. The choice is yours. But the gates are closing. And when they finally shut, when everyone realizes simultaneously that their wealth is just a number on a screen backed by the unpayable debts of their neighbors, the learning will happen too late to matter. The congressman sits in his office tonight, reading more letters. More people drowning. More people desperate. He could help them. He could pass his bill. He could be a hero. But he knows what happens to Mary Thompson if he does. He knows the trap. So do you now. The question is what you do with that knowledge before the crowd figures it out and rushes for exits that no longer open.